Chapter 11, Hacking ESG. Question to supplier. Do you measure your greenhouse gases? Supplier answer, we don't have any. We're not in the agriculture business. Globalization fundamentally reshaped business for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. One of the enduring side effects of this change was the digital connectivity that came with the flattening of the global business environment. As global supply chains grew, shipping raw materials to China for manufacturing, packaging, and shipping to regional distribution centers and individual stores required vastly more connectivity and data exchange. Cloud computing, new fiber networks, smartphones, 5G, commercial space operations, new sensors, and computing devices have further shrunk the world by bringing more data to countries, companies, and even individuals. While all of us are still improving said data collection and analysis of all this data, as explored in Chapter 3, Intelligence, Data Underpins Everything, there's an unexpected benefit to putting this infrastructure in place. Greater connectivity, data collection, and computing capacity empower us to take a bigger stake in creating the world we want to see. The analyzing and sharing of all this information makes us more informed consumers. It allows us to take a more proactive role in addressing the issues facing our world, whether it's war, famine, clean water access, human rights, Black Lives Matter, protecting the bees, saving the coral reefs, stopping gun violence, education, microplastics, banning landmines, or any of the other 1,000 ills that plague our global society. For example, I don't have to go to Indonesia or Malaysia to see the deforestation caused by palm oil production. I can see it in satellite photos and measure and track its deleterious effects over time without leaving my desk. I don't have to rely on annual reports or reporters to travel there and publish stories. I can literally see it. In the not-so-distant future, I expect to be able to dial up satellite imagery on demand, or there will be satellites trained on these hotspots 24/7. This is a staggering breakthrough in terms of information transparency. I fully expect that as the range of sensors and data collection mechanisms expands, we'll continue to have access to vast amounts of new and useful data. This data will fundamentally change consumer expectations, governmental regulations, and regulatory compliance. Moreover, the social media aspect of this will amplify progress on all these fronts. As an example, a news article about Morgan Freeman converting his 124-acre ranch into a bee sanctuary has been catching fire on social media and creating awareness for the declining bee population. The increasing attention to ESG means that companies need to get a whole lot more sophisticated in their efforts. Simply rating suppliers for the annual report is no longer good enough. I admit that it's easy to criticize enterprises for misguided ESG efforts. I'm not trying to score an easy shot here, but rather to start a deeper dialogue on how companies can create more meaningful and impactful ESG initiatives. Before we do that, though, we need to acknowledge that corporations are being asked to do the following, and probably even more. 1. Policies and regulations. 2. Human rights. 3. Environmental. 4. Consumer safety. 5. Diversity, equity, inclusion. 6. Social justice. This is an ambitious and overwhelming agenda, much like the never-ending list of risk threats. Corporations seem to be asked to take on the tasks that governments and NGOs are unwilling or unable to tackle. How can a single company solve systematic racism? I think it may be a little unfair to dump all of this on corporations. Most enterprises exist to make money, but that's not to say that companies get a pass on ESG. I would be very happy to see companies stop polluting our waterways or setting rivers on fire, spewing tons of carbon, and hiring suppliers that violate human rights. But like risk management, we need to focus on what's logical and practical versus doing what governments have failed to do. In that context, supply chain security and risk intersect with corporate ESG efforts. Both are headed for a reckoning, not a doom and gloom reckoning, but rather a positive and interesting one. While most ESG efforts are laudable, they lack real-world practicality to truly move the needle on risk management. Most large enterprises use very slick language to show various ways they seek to address supply chain sustainability. That's usually something to the effect of improving manufacturing to reduce, recycle, or reclaim waste, employ recyclable or compostable packaging, reduce Scope 3 carbon emissions, and assess suppliers. Most companies are even adding ESG to the board of directors initiatives. These actions and platitudes all look nice on paper. However, in an era where the climate crisis is growing and consumers have access to equally powerful data as supply chain managers, the bar must be set significantly higher. Instead of simply reporting, companies need to take bolder steps to support the reserving, restoring, and rewilding of the Earth's resources. ESG Intelligence, Recycling. In early 2021, I was outside my house for an impromptu COVID concert. 2 guys playing guitars on our street. I was talking to my neighbor, JD Embody, who's a serial entrepreneur and founder of Everest Labs. As we listened to 1970s and 1980s rock covers, he started telling me about his latest project, to improve the efficacy of recycling centers with robots. I had to restrain myself from visibly rolling my eyes. I was thinking, you gotta be kidding me with this, another do-gooder trying to ride the ESG hype train. However, when he asked me, don't you work with CPOs and heads of supply chain for CPG companies? I suddenly became more attentive. I told him I did and wanted to understand his angle. JD explained that he was setting up robotic arms on recycling lines to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of recycling in waste management. Using humans to sort trash from recycling is self-defeating and severely limited. A waste line with humans can pick only between 1 and 15 items per minute, whereas a robot can pick 40 to 60 items in the same amount of time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without breaks. Not only can robots more effectively remove recyclable materials from the waste lines, but they also observe, catalog, and report on all the material that traverses the waste lines. To make the robots work, Everest Labs had to set up 3D cameras to collect and map the data of what was going down each line. From there, Everest Labs engineers wrote proprietary machine learning algorithms to identify each type of valuable packaging in the shortest amount of time. We're talking milliseconds. Then direct the robotic arm to pick up these objects and deposit them in the correct bins with the highest success rate. It took the Everest Labs team more than 3 years just to get their software and robotic end-of-arm tools right. All of that was intellectually interesting, but not compelling. Then he hit me with what felt like the proverbial right hook. The project created a massive source of real-time data about the contents of every recycling line. The AI could differentiate the type of material, aluminum, plastic, paper, and most importantly, the branding, Coke, Pepsi, Budweiser. It took 30 seconds for the shock to wear off. This development had huge implications for ESG efforts because now we can tie sales data with recycling data. Using this data, we can quantify the number of products that are being recycled versus going to landfill. When it comes to environmental producer responsibility, or EPR, this allows each brand to determine what proportion of responsibility is theirs. More importantly, it allows us to see landfills as a new source of supply. This means that counting the reclamation or non-reclamation of recyclable materials will improve vastly, which will in turn provide a huge opportunity, or a huge problem, for enterprises. Essentially, companies will be hit with a tsunami of recycling and reclamation data. What will that data show? This all becomes vastly more compelling when we consider that demands for virgin aluminum have been steadily increasing, and in some cases, it isn't even available. The robots in recycling centers can recycle more aluminum from waste lines and increase recycling efficiency. We can even get a real-world accounting of our EPR. In 2018, the total recycling rate of aluminum containers and packaging, which includes beverage containers, food containers, foil, and other aluminum packaging, was 35%. Within this number, the most recycled category of aluminum was beer and soft drink cans at 50%. In 2018, landfills received approximately 2 million tons of aluminum. While efforts are in place to recycle aluminum, it's not enough. In the U.S. alone, nearly 800 million worth of aluminum cans are lost to landfill. The gap between post-industrial and post-consumer recycling efforts must be closed. The collection process does not need to be the same everywhere, but should be more easily understood. In security and risk management, the question is whether we're visualizing the data we have or the data we need. Often the greatest risks come from the places with the least amount of data, say a government-owned factory in China. If we employ the same approach to ESG, we find that the greatest opportunities are where we have the least visibility. Nowhere is that clearer than in the waste management project JD explained to me. It will show what vast opportunities exist, and it will show how slapping a recycling logo on aluminum cans means absolutely nothing in practical terms if most of the recyclable aluminum ends up in a landfill. Collecting data from hard-to-reach places reinforces the idea that companies need to come out of their ivory towers and look at what's happening all the way down at the bottom of their value chain. More specifically, we can now trace every bit of aluminum going into landfill, which will give governments more actionable data to enforce EPR legislation. So, any CPG using aluminum, especially anybody who deals with third parties, should take a much closer look at this ecosystem. More broadly, tech companies should take note because this technology and intelligence will eventually make its way into the electronics recycling value chain as well. ESG tools beyond scanning, scraping, and surveys. Using data and insights provided by ProcureTech, I spent a good chunk of the summer of 2022 evaluating more than 230 ESG tools. I was putting off writing this book. I hadn't realized there were so many ESG tools. Of that vast number, only 5 were remotely interesting to me. Subsequently, I found an additional 7 interesting. Everything else was underwhelming at best. Some of the solutions I analyzed were not relevant: health and safety, consulting, or nonprofits. But most fell into 5 broad categories: reporting, questionnaire, traceability, offsets, or ratings. All of these are laudable initiatives, but they're rather simplistic and problematic. Carbon offsets have been debunked or at least sufficiently challenged to suggest that this is not a legitimate way of solving the ESG problem. ESG questionnaires are as foolish for ESG as they are for risk management. See Chapter 8, Risk Management, the Bridge Between Security and Resilience. The quote at the top of this chapter is an apt example of this fallacy. Even if the suppliers are willing to provide the necessary information, we have to check to see whether they truly understand what is being asked of them, and that greenhouse gases have nothing to do with growing agriculture. Traceability that relies on human input is neither reliable nor efficient, and digital device traceability can be problematic. See the Tony Soprano issue in Chapter 4, Tools. We are in a post-ERP world, we just haven't accepted it yet. Despite scraping millions of public websites for information, rating companies are only surfacing and evaluating a highly biased subset of information. Finally, charging suppliers to be audited by a third party once a year suffers from a twofold problem. First, an annual audit allows a lot of risk and environmental damage to be done in the intervening 364 days. Second, how thorough is an annual compliance check? Who's doing this audit, and how well versed are they in the topic that they're being tasked with evaluating? Or are they simply asking perfunctory questions to check the box? This begs the question of whether the annual third-party audit is simply ESG theater. The true impact and ESG opportunity will come from the places that are hardest to see, cloaked behind the secrecy of governments and in otherwise opaque locations. Finally, reporting is great, but building a carbon cube or other ESG dashboard is only at the visualization part of the data value chain, restricted to telling you what happened or what is happening. Much like spend cubes, they simply show where the money was spent, which is good, but it doesn't change the fact that whatever amount was spent is no longer in the corporate bank account. Spend reporting can merely be used to inform future negotiations and allocations of work. The same is true for carbon cubes. Every ounce of carbon tracked is merely showing what has been expended into the air already, and you can't get it back unless there's some massive carbon capture technological innovation. In short, most of these ESG solutions involve some measure of scanning, scraping, surveys, and reporting, none of which does much to directly change outcomes. ESG people, palm oil producers and consumers. Palm oil, used in more than half of all packaged products in the U.S., is under threat amid a perfect storm of skyrocketing demand and unsustainable production processes. We do not need another article denouncing the deleterious effects of palm oil. It is widely known that palm oil production is bad, very bad. The issue became a key theme during Season 2 of the popular Netflix series Grace and Frankie, where Frankie, played by Lily Tomlin, takes an ethical stand against the corporate use of palm oil. Even beyond popular culture, one can hardly escape the constant drumbeat of negative news enumerating how rainforests are being cleared and burned to produce palm oil, threatening the extinction of orangutans, pygmy elephants, and Sumatran rhinos. This activity alone produces vast amounts of carbon greenhouse gases. Palm oil production is also responsible for human rights violations, as small landowners and indigenous people are driven from their land to make way for plantations. And investigators, including 14-year-old Elouise Epstein, a Girl Scout in rural Tennessee, have put a spotlight on palm oil producers who use physical and sexual violence and forced child labor. Any one of these reasons would be enough to eliminate palm oil from our global supply chain. Yet one extraordinarily good reason supersedes all of the others. The production of palm oil is creating an environmental disaster that will threaten the entire supply of palm oil. For perhaps the first time in history, producing a commodity directly threatens the long-term supply and viability of the commodity itself. We refer to this as a circular risk. Over the past 50 years, demand for palm oil has risen sharply, with annual production quadrupling between 1995 and 2015, and this is expected to quadruple yet again by 2050. This ever-growing demand for palm oil and its unsustainable production processes are now fueling its own destruction. The impending boom. A close look at the supply chain reveals that 84% of the world's palm oil is produced by two countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. In 2020, Indonesia produced 43.5 million tons and Malaysia produced 19.9 million tons. Both countries are starting to face serious consequences of climate change, specifically severe weather events such as heavy rain, severe flooding, and landslides, along with rising sea levels between 2.4 and 3.8 millimeters per year in the region. In Indonesia, palm oil plantations are concentrated in two islands, Borneo and Sumatra. In 2019, the 5 leading provinces produced about 2/3 of all the palm oil in Indonesia. In the past 2 years, each of these provinces have reported devastating flooding and landslides, repeatedly wiping out communities and killing people. Research suggests these instances occur more often in palm oil villages. Additionally, rising sea levels are engulfing new land masses in these provinces every day. The situation in Malaysia is nearly identical. A 2020 scientific paper found a negative relationship between annual average temperatures and palm oil production. If temperatures rise between 1 degree Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius, palm oil production could decrease by 10 to 41% because of a decline in palm seeds. Additionally, since palm oil farms thrive closer to the coastline, the rise in sea levels will steadily eliminate the amount of arable land. Taken together, these two trends signal a major disruption ahead. We're left of boom. The use of palm oil is rapidly shifting from something that has bad optics for individual companies to something that is high risk with long-term supply and costs under threat. With their ever-increasing demands for palm oil, companies and consumers are killing their own source. We can clearly see the boom coming. There's a short horizon between today's status quo and tomorrow's supply shortages and price increases. Companies can make bolder moves now, not just committing to using sustainable palm oil, but also switching to alternatives or doing something different. It's better to absorb the switching cost now because prices will skyrocket as the supply is compromised. This is crucial to ensure that demand for palm oil is kept in check and doesn't continue to accelerate towards total supply destruction. If ever there was a time to redesign, reformulate, and reinvent, it's now. Applying the hacking mindset. If I had the answer to palm oil production, I would quit my great job at Carney and dedicate myself to the elimination of palm oil like a good liberal I aspire to be. But perhaps we're looking at the problem backward. We assume that shelf stability of palm oil is the dependent variable here, and finding an odorless, clear, and tasteless oil that will hold up for an equal amount of time is what we need an answer for. However, what if we took a hacker's mindset to the problem? Could we use highly optimized and flexible supply chains to reduce the time from when a product is manufactured to when it's consumed? In other words, can we drastically reduce manufacture to consumption from months and years to weeks and days? If we could do this by using tighter forecasting, manufacturing, and distribution, then we wouldn't need to account for such long shelf lives. This would open up different types of, and hopefully less deleterious, replacements to palm oil. Hacking ESG, 5 takeaways. 1. Addressing ESG is a key part of a supply chain security and risk management. 2. Audits, web scraping, and surveys make little tangible impact. 3. Look for new sources of meaningful ESG data. 4. Build bespoke ESG-based intelligence. 5. Approach ESG problems anew with the hacking mindset.